Okie dokie. Just going to, before we start, take you through a few slides that I do on all of my talks now that we're all using Zoom. And this is just to make sure that everyone is on the same page in as to how we use the application. So I think everyone has got their microphones muted, which is absolutely fantastic. That means my words are a lot clearer for everybody. And we're not going to be turning any microphones on, so we don't need to worry about many of those other things. I do suggest that you try and limit any distractions that you have around you. So try putting your phone on silent and try to avoid checking your emails or answering too many other things as you're watching, because I have found myself when I'm doing these Zoom talks that it really does detract from the amount of information you take away with you. So if you want to take lots away, those are my recommendations. Try and limit how much you're being distracted by anything else. You've clearly all managed to get onto Zoom okay. We're not going to be unmuting the videos today, but if you want to ask any questions, down the bottom there should be the chat box function, which you can see in the middle of the screen. Pop any questions in there, and I've got a couple of question points in the presentation, and we'll stop at those points and just review any questions that have come through all together before continuing. If you want to change your view, you can change that at the top in the corner. And if I ask you for a reaction, which I may do, it depends how fun I'm feeling today, you can find the reaction buttons down there. Okie dokie. So, and the last thing before we get started is a quick introduction to Heritage Lincolnshire and myself. So Heritage Lincolnshire, for those of you who don't know, is a local charity. So we are based in Lincolnshire. We are working for Lincolnshire, and we work primarily to try and conserve the rich history of the county for the benefit of people who live and work in the area. And we're also very keen on promoting the really rich heritage and history we have, to encourage people from outside of Lincolnshire to come into the county and really enjoy that as well. So we do all sorts of things, from working on archaeological sites with our archaeological team, APS. We have a community archaeology team. That's part of the work that I do. So going out and meeting with people, running workshops, running talks. We have a buildings conservation team. We are now looking at running some heritage venues in the area. So you may have heard of the Old King's Head, which is a fantastic place to go for a coffee or a meal, just to plug that one, down in Curtin near Boston. So we're doing all sorts of things really to try and really help Lincolnshire shine, because we've got a fantastic, rich tapestry here of history and heritage, and it just isn't really heard about in the country as a whole enough as it should be. And that's me there. I'm Lydia Hendry, so I'm a community archaeologist with Heritage Lincolnshire. And just to give you a brief background to myself and why I'm qualified to talk to you about this today, I studied archaeology at university, and I used to work in commercial archaeology. So that's going out ahead of building projects to do an archaeological survey of the ground to make sure nothing important is being disrupted or being lost. And after doing that for a while, I moved to APS in Heritage Lincolnshire, and I was working in Lincolnshire on that work. And I think I must have talked too much, because after a couple of months there, they quickly shifted me across to community. And I've been doing this for a few years now, and I absolutely love it. I really thrive off of being able to tell other people the amazing things that we have. So that's me, and that's a quick background as to who I am. So let's get started. Before we get going, I want to just point out a few kind of things in archaeology that can trip people up. First of all, I may sometimes differ between two different types of dating. So of course, everyone knows of BC and AD. Of course, we're in the year 2021 AD, and before that we go BC. So if I'm talking about the Iron Age started in 800 BC, so that's 2,800 years ago. Sometimes in archaeology, we use a different dating system, which is BP, which means before present, in which case the Iron Age would be 2821 BP rather than 800 BC. So there's a really big difference there. It mainly comes up when we're talking about prehistoric periods, but it is something to watch out for because it can completely throw you if you're thinking about the wrong dating technique there. Also, I'll put this very common joke about how many of someone does it take to screw in a light bulb. When it comes to archaeologists, we do like to work in a team. We take a long time labeling every single artifact we find. We use every single piece of evidence we can to discover more about the past. But as this joke here says, we can also conclude that a light bulb may have been used to store cornmeal. And the joke there is basically, we can get things wrong. We are using every bit of evidence we can to discover things about the past, but it is only ever going to be a theory, and we actually can't prove it any more than the evidence we have. So I may be saying things here today that you completely disagree with my interpretation. That is completely fine. I may say some things today that next year are going to be completely disproved. That's absolutely fine as well. Archaeology is all about discussing different theories and trying to find the ones that suit the evidence best. So archaeology is quite literally the study of human past. As I go into schools a lot of the time, it is not paleontology. We're not dealing with dinosaurs today. I am very much looking for evidence of what humans have been doing in the past. And as a species, we do interact with our environment in quite a major way. We don't just walk through a landscape. We like to plough a field or build a fence or build a house. And this means that we leave markers on the landscape that can last hundreds and thousands of years to tell a story of what people were doing there. And so just by walking around the landscape, we can tell a story of human past. So even though landscape archaeology is not going to be putting a spade in the soil, we're not going to be digging anything up, it is still archaeology. We are still using the evidence we can see around us to study the human past. So I've divided this talk into two sections. First of all, it's going to be more skills based. So if you're walking around the landscape, if you're going for a walk or you've got a village you want to research, I'm going to be talking you through some of the skills you need to really cultivate to be able to understand the landscape for yourself. And then in the second half of the talk, we're going to be having a look at the context of Lincolnshire. So I'm going to go through some of the features that you may come across that in the Lincolnshire landscape that are particularly important and valuable that we need to celebrate in the area. Now, between these two sections, I will have a short coffee break. So if you need to just dash off to the loo, get another cup of coffee, you can. And we'll also have a break in the middle for questions and then another break at the end for questions again. So, what to look for? Now, in a way, this is a bit of a trick question because when you're walking around the landscape, if you want to understand it, you need to look for everything. So every single detail that you can see, you need to be questioning in your mind, how did that get there? Why does that look like that? What could have caused these processes to create this landscape looking as it is today? So in a way, it's not what to look for, it's more how to look at things, the questions you need to be asking to understand them. So number one is actually get out and have a look. I can tell you all sorts of techniques all the live long day, but the best thing you can do is actually to get out and have a look for yourself. And honestly, question everything you see. So this is going to be a slow walk. You're not going to be racing through. You're not going to be on a timer. And everything you see, you need to question, when did that get there? Why is it there? Is it man-made or is it natural? So for example, around the area that I walk, I would probably be seeing the railway line, in which case I could question, how long has that railway line been there? Why was there the need to put in that railway line? I know the railway goes to Skegness, so that might have some impact on either the transport of goods around the country or the transport of tourists going to the coast. And that's going to have an impact on my home village. There's lots and lots of fields around where I am. Now, fields are really interesting. Looking at the hedge lines, you need to look at the hedges and go, well, how long have those hedges been there? And think of different ways you can try and find that information out. Have a look in the fields themselves. Are there any odd lumps and bumps? How did they get there? Is it caused by water coming down the slope, or is that actually a man-made lump or bump? You are not going to be getting answers in this stage. You are going to be building up a list of questions. And you might find it really useful to take a notebook with you, or even to take a print off of a map of the area, and you can circle things in the area and say, you know, what's this? Check this out. Also, in landscape archaeology, it's quite helpful to make a note of place names, because place names often do reveal something about a place. So if you're going for a longer walk, just make a note of all the villages that you walk through, and make a note to go back and actually research what those names mean. In addition to taking lots of notes, it can be really useful to take pictures. Now, these don't have to be really high quality pictures with a super fancy camera. They can just be pictures taken on your phone. But what I do recommend is you make notes of what those pictures are of. I cannot tell you how many photos I've got on my camera and on my phone of soil and trees and field that I have now got no idea what they are showing me. I've got no idea where I took them, and I've got no idea where they came from. So please, please, please make notes of where you take your photos, because it's so easy to get lost and to forget and lose track of where they came from. And then the next stage is simply to go back home and research all those questions that you have listed when you were walking around. So a really good idea is to have a look at maps. If you've seen lots of lumps and bumps in a field, I would probably first of all go to an OS map, so that's the Ordnance Survey, and often they will have marked, that there is an old medieval castle in that field, or there is a deserted medieval village. And that can be quite useful for your bigger earthworks, where you can really clearly see those lumps and bumps. You can also use Google, and I'll be showing you how we can use that in a moment. And basically just use these maps where the information is already known to try and match up that what you saw on the ground with what has already been recorded. Then you can look up place names. Now, if you go to the library, you'll be able to find dictionaries of place names, and it'll have the place name that you're looking for, but then a definition. So, for example, I used to live in Woolcott near Billingham, and the definition of that place name is wool came from the word Welsh, and cot means settlement. So it was possible that Woolcott was originally settled by someone who came from Wales. And that tells me something about the history of the area, and that's going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And then also have a look at the map and see if you can see any patterns. Now, if you still have questions about things that you can't reveal from the maps, there are other places you can go to look for that information, and we're going to be going through that in a moment. But once you've answered as many questions as you can, go out again and look again with your new knowledge. So go on the exact same route, and rather than going this time and making lots of questions, you can walk around going, yes, that hedge line was laid in when they did enclosure. And yes, that village is older than the other village. And I can see that now because the houses look different. You can go around and actually understand the landscape. So first of all, go out and enjoy it. Enjoy being able to walk around and go, yes, I feel more connected with the landscape. I understand how this landscape looks like it does, and all the different influences that have played upon it. But you're also going to go down the rabbit hole, because undoubtedly you are going to come across more questions. You're going to want to find out more detail. And so you go back home again, you do more research, and you then come back outside, and on and on and on goes the cycle. You can go as long as you like on this. You really, really can. You are never going to get to the end of the information that you can find out about a site. Now, I am going to be taking you through some of the places where you can find this information to answer the questions you have when you're going out and about. but that there is more than I can fit into this presentation. So if you have further questions, you're always free to message me directly, or I do have a different talk which is about how to do research at home. Okie dokie, so going out and about to do landscape archaeology, in my mind, always has an image like this. You're in a beautiful scenic location, it's blue sky, you've got lots of lovely equipment, you're making fantastic notes, and you're feeling really well and in control of it. I'm going to break that illusion for all of you right now. More often it looks like this. You are in your raincoat, it's drizzling almost always, and there's perhaps not quite the same scenery that you imagine you're going to see, but that doesn't mean there is nothing there to see. In fact, I would probably argue that the rural landscapes that we have are going to be far more information filled than the really scenic landscapes of the Peak District, because this is where people have been living and working and seeing out their lives generation after generation, leaving marks on the landscape. So this is where we're really going to be revealing those stories. Now, one thing to be aware of when you're going out and about is this word here, palimpsest. I can never say it, excuse me. And basically the definition of this word is, it comes from a manuscript page, and in previous days, vellum or parchment that people were writing on was incredibly expensive, and so you're not going to be wasting the paper you have, and so people try to reuse the paper that that they were writing on. So either they would write in a different direction and then write directly over the writing that had been put on there previously, so you could read both layers together, or they can try wiping off some of the previous writing or scraping it off to reuse the paper or the vellum. And this means that on one piece of paper, you can have multiple documents from different periods. Now, this is actually directly relatable to landscape archaeology, because in one landscape, we have Neolithic long barrows and medieval villages and Roman roads and modern day new builds and railway lines from the Industrial Revolution. It's all built into one landscape. And so you are never going to go walking and say, yes, this is a wholly medieval landscape, or go, yes, this is a wholly Stone Age landscape, or yes, this is completely untouched by human hand. That doesn't exist in this country. We have constantly been living on top of each other for thousands of years. And so when you go through a landscape, you are going to be seeing lots and lots and lots of different time periods in one go. So in the picture here, this one isn't from Lincolnshire. You can see we have I think, is this Neolithic or Bronze Age henge going on here. You can see some stone circles within it as well. And you've got a modern day road coming right the way through the middle. You've got a medieval church there. And so the challenge is, first of all, to understand all these landscapes together, but also to separate them out. And for this, you really need to be using your imagination as much as you can. So take the area you're researching and in your mind, clear everything that you can see, except the hills and the major landscapes that, and the river down the bottom, all those major landscape features. And then slowly build it up in your mind. So this is good to do perhaps on that second walk around when you've got some information about the different areas. So first of all, if you have got some Bronze Age barrows in a field, first of all, add them in your mind. And then go, so there must have been people walking around. We've lost their settlement, but we have their barrows, we have their graves there. And then next, you may have had some Iron Age fields, which may be on the other side. So build them into your mind. And then the Roman road that comes right the way through the middle of my village. There probably would have been some houses either side of that. So now you can imagine the barrows being grown over in the fields, and you've got this new fancy Roman road cutting through. Then, of course, the Roman period ends in this country, and we have the Anglo-Saxons, and eventually they start building churches. And so that lovely, beautiful stone-built church we have in the middle of the village, that would have been surrounded by lots of wooden architecture that we've now lost. But you can imagine that lovely, beautiful new stone church with all of those much lower class dwellings all the way around. They get knocked down, they get built up again with perhaps more durable materials over time. And then all of a sudden, all the railway lines being cut across the landscape because it's the Industrial Revolution and we're having to move things around a lot more frequently. And so just take each period in your mind and slowly build it up. And each time think, what else would have been here that I'm now not seeing because it's been knocked down, it's been built over. And you can slowly start to imagine the development of your landscape, but in a way that is perhaps more respectful to each period. And it makes a bit more sense. It's less of a jumble because you can see how the landscape developed in your own time. So if you want to go out and do landscape archaeology, even if you're just walking around and wanting to learn more about your area, it very much is almost an art in a way. It's not something I can give you a book on. It's not something I can give you a checklist on because every area is different. You need to go out. You need to actually look at things. You need to notice things that look different. And you need to develop an eye and a feeling for the patterns that you see in towns and countries. So you can identify where the differences are and identify where there might be stories that can be told. As important as this are to recognize the things that don't make sense, because these are the things that can really tell us stories. So, for example, we often find in this country large isolated ruins of churches seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Now that doesn't make sense. Traditionally, we like to put churches in the middle of villages because that's where we can easily access them for worship. Now, the story behind this is it's actually surrounded by what we call in archaeology a DMV. Now, this stands for a deserted medieval village. We have quite a few of them in this country because in the medieval period, we suffered depopulation events. The most significant of those was the Black Death, the plague. And it caused some villages to shrink so much that they were not sustainable by themselves anymore. So the remaining people moved to a different village, leaving their stone church standing, the wooden buildings still standing. And of course, the wooden buildings would have rotted down and decayed, leaving perhaps some lumps and bumps in the landscape. And you can see in this field around here, we have some shapes that may have been old fields. You can see here, that's the old graveyard there. I think you've got an old walkway coming down here. But the churches, being stone, don't degrade in the same way. They slowly break down over time. So this one's, I think it's lost its roof now here. But they are left standing and they get absorbed by the rest of the landscape. So you'll see them standing in the middle of fields or on the side of roads, just being a little bit out of place with their context. And so going there and saying, that church looks unusual, you can reveal a whole story about a lost settlement. Up here, we can see something else unusual. This river here is incredibly straight and it's got very, very straight sides coming down here. So a few of you may have already noted that this is man-made. It's not a natural river. And this has actually been cut by the monks who used to live in these church buildings down here. So that's telling me a story about who was living there, about what they were doing, and they needed the water probably to run a mill of some kind. And so that tells me about the industries they're working. If we have a look at this one, this is actually one of my favorite things to spot because you can see it absolutely everywhere in this county. It's really common, especially in the wolds, but it's a really, really easy thing to overlook as well. And you can see the field is really lumpy bumpy and it's very regular as well. Here we go. Now, I will admit this picture hasn't actually come from Lincolnshire, but the picture itself with the fence posts show what I'm trying to show really well. What we have here is actually old plough skulls. Now, in the medieval period, the way that people ploughed was incredibly, not destructive, but it affected the earth a lot because they were deep ploughing, and then they were pushing the ploughed soil into ridges due to their agriculture. And so they created ridges and furrows to grow their crops on. Now, we can still see those ridges and furrows today, which I find absolutely incredible. Just how people ploughing the fields changes how we see the landscape. And you can see them most often in horse fields, because of course those aren't being ploughed today and the patterns in the field aren't being disrupted. So often I will notice these in horse or in sheep fields. But if you see these regular lumps and bumps, that will be medieval ridge and furrow ploughing. You can actually see this on Google Maps a bit as well, and I'll show you that in a moment. Now, one thing to be aware of with ridge and furrow is the wider the ridges and the furrows were, the larger the oxen team was to do the ploughing, because they'd have needed a wider turning circle at each end. So in the wolds, it's noted that the ridge and furrows are quite wide, they're quite far spaced apart. And that's simply because if you imagine some of the hills in the wolds, they need a big team of oxen to be able to pull the plough up and down. In flatter areas, you might see much, much thinner, more narrow ridge and furrow, because they don't need the same weight and force to be able to plough the field. And then we have an urban example here. I think this one is from Boston. But you can see you've got this beautiful older building here, and it's lovely, less lovely extension coming off the side. And that in itself is going to be telling me an urban story. So it tells me a story of how this building was built and was used, and it perhaps wasn't big enough for purpose anymore. So it was extended twice. You can see different architecture in this building to this building. So it's been gradually extended over the years. Now, this might prompt me to actually research the history of the building. Has it always been used for the same thing, and that thing has become more important, or more people have needed it? Or has it actually been changing use, and that change in use has required extra space? I also think that when you're going out and doing landscape archaeology, you need to have quite an open mind. And so sometimes you need to change your perspective as well. We all have bias. We're all born with it. Our experiences in the world give it to us. And even when we try and be as unbiased as possible, we will still have unconscious bias. It affects the way we interpret the world. And it means that it's our brains basically trying to understand things. Our brains trying to make patterns, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we have to understand is different people have different ways of seeing the world. So, for example, often today, we will see a river as a dividing line. It might be the boundary between countries or between counties. Either way, they can sometimes be an inconvenience. I was a fair while back now doing a project in the Isle of Axholme, which is in the north of the county in North Lincolnshire. And to get across to that area, I had to use a bridge in Gainsborough, and I was meeting a big group of volunteers. I was a good 45 minutes late for that meeting because there was an accident on the bridge, and I had to drive all the way round to get to the next bridge, which was a good few miles away. That was an inconvenience to me. That river blocked my way. And often today we can see waterways in that light. I mean, if you have a look at, of course, we've got Britain here, we are cut off from France. If we want to go anywhere else, we have to take a boat, we have to take a plane. We are cut off from other people because of the water. Now, in previous days, this wasn't the case because we didn't have cars back then. the best we could sometimes manage was a horse and cart. And so actually going by boat was quicker than walking. So we have to completely flip our perspective to understand that in the past, waterways were actually the highways. So living on a river wasn't living by a boundary, it was living by a really easy access to trade. And it meant you were actually better connected with the rest of the world. If we go way back to the Bronze Age, where's my mouse gone? Here we are. The people living all around the coast here are actually, in the culture that we find in archaeology, are more similar to people living here than they are to people living here, because it's so much easier to have contact with these people. So we very much see a difference between perhaps the coast dwellers and the inland dwellers. It's a completely different way of looking at the landscape. We also have an image of a house here in the middle of nowhere. And today we'd immediately go, that house is in the backwater. You can't farm that landscape. There's no crops growing there. Who knows why you'd want to have a house there? Well, in the past, most of the time, yes, we see settlements where there's good agriculture. But sometimes we see settlements where you can't grow things very easily, but because there are monuments there, there's a henge, there's a particularly significant spot for people who lived in the past. So just because an area is not significant for us today doesn't mean it was significant, it was insignificant in the past. Okie dokie. So now we've got a couple of pictures that I'm just going to use as examples of how to look at the landscape. So this is just an image from Lincolnshire of walking down the road, and is very much the kind of image you might see if you choose to walk around your village or town. And it might on first glance look like you can't interpret that much from it. However, let's stop, let's slow down, and let's have a proper look at what we can see. So the most significant thing for me in the landscape that draws my eye is the road. Now, this roadway here is clearly tarmacked, so it's clearly a modern use road, but looking at it, it's going straight into a village, and in the village, I can see a church. Now, that tells me that this is not a new build village. It's been here quite a while, and you might well need to go to the church, have a proper look around it, research the history of it, but I know for a fact that this is a Norman church. So I can do that from here. So that tells me this village has been here since at least the Norman period. It's probably been here before that as well. So this road, underneath this road, is quite likely going to be a track. And that might even be the same medieval track that people were using to access this village for hundreds of years. So this is a key access point to the village. Next to the village, to the road even, we have this dike here. Now, we often see dikes next to fields in this country because, of course, in this county, because, of course, we have a lot of wetter locations that need draining, or if it rains a lot, they need to let the water run off, otherwise the crops or the field is going to be flooded. So that tells me about the environment of the area. People have had to do management here to ensure that the land remains usable. This also tells me that people feel that this land is worth the investment of digging a dike. Looking across into the field, there is also a hump coming up here. So this is probably where the dirt and the infill from this dike has been placed. So they've also been putting almost a little of a barrier here as well. So clearly drainage is an issue. Now in this field, we've got some trees. These trees don't look particularly random. They've been planted together in a little copse. So they've probably been planted strategically. If I knew more about trees, I could probably look at them and say, oh yes, they're probably this old. I don't know about trees. I know about the past, a lot more about old stones, but that's something that I might make a note that to have a look at, see if I can find records of how long those trees have been there. Looking into this field, there are a load of ruined stones and abandoned stones. So this might actually be quite a significant settlement. It may have been an old medieval castle, or it may have been some old houses that have simply been knocked down and they're not being used anymore. They may simply be shelters for sheep. I need to get closer to them. I need to have a look at maps. I need to do some research to find out what they are. In the distance, I can also see some houses. Now, from this distance, I can see this house has 2 chimneys, which means it's probably a higher quality house. It's also made of stone. So there's probably been some money in this village as well. People have been able to build using better materials. Looking back over here, we've got some telephone wires. So this village is connected up to the telephone network. Perhaps not surprising, but it is worth taking a moment to think about when that happened. How long ago were people not able to simply ring someone up or use electricity? That's always a nice one to do with kids because they're always shocked at how recent that has become a thing. So just standing, I can reveal lots and lots and lots of different things about this landscape. I can judge the age of the village. I can judge the fact that agriculture has been important, or if this is a stone castle, perhaps, or the remains of it, I can tell this perhaps a more important settlement than it is now. I am listing lots and lots and lots of questions that I want to go back and research. And with every step I take down this road, I'm going to be getting a different view, and I'm going to be seeing different things that are going to raise more questions as I go. So by the end of my walk, I'm going to have quite a long list of notes, of things that I've noticed, and of things that I want to research further. So that was a rural landscape. Let's try an urban landscape as well. Now, a few of you may recognise this one as Boston. And just because we don't have lots of fields where we're going to be seeing lots of lumps and bumps of old lost medieval villages, doesn't mean there's nothing here to see. Now, I'm always amazed looking through Boston that if you take a moment to actually have a look at the buildings, how beautiful the buildings are. I really do recommend going for a walk through the town there. But once again, if I just stop and have a look here, I can see lots of things that are already drawing my attention. First of all, this is a significant river. This has got some serious water going through it. And if I was to spend the day in Boston, I would see that the level changes. This is a tidal river as well. I can see that the sides have had a lot of investment in them, which suggests to me that flooding may have been an issue around here, and they're trying to control how the water flows through the town. I can see at the back these beautiful warehouse buildings. So I can tell that people have been coming here and probably trading, using the river as a highway to move around. If I wanted to spend more time, I'd probably take the time to cross the river and actually actively walk down there and take a moment to look at each of the buildings. Some of them may have a date stone on them. If I was an architecture expert, I could go down and probably tell you a lot more details about them. But we've got some lovely Georgian looking things here as well. This, I believe, is from the war period. So that's telling me about much more recent history as well. And once again, we have a road just here. And so people are using the area now to drive around. And once again, the river is a sticking point where once it was the highway, now it's where you queue to try and get across the river as you move around the town. So lots and lots and lots of different stories coming out. Just keeping an eye on the time. Yes, I need to speed up as I thought I probably would. Right. Okay. So once we've gone out and about, we want to come back home and we want to do our research to find out more about those questions that we've been listing. So first of all, we have OS maps. I like OS maps. I find them really easy to use and read. They have a lot of information listed on them, including archaeological remains. I hasten to add, not all, definitely not all. And there are places where you can get more information, but it's a really good starting point to try and identify big lumps and bumps, so to speak. If you want to feel better acquainted with OS maps, you don't feel that confident with using them at the moment, I recommend you get an OS map of your area and you really take the time to look at it. And what I often do on one of my different courses, reading maps, is I get lots and lots of different colours of sticky dots, and I tell people to put a blue sticky dot on all the medieval churches, put a red sticky dot on all the prehistoric cairns and barrows, put a yellow sticky dot on all modern features that are listed. And actually that means that using these different colours, you can see the different patterns in the landscape. You might see how all the prehistoric barrows and cairns are actually staying on the high ground, or how all the medieval churches are near perhaps lots of rivers to help people move around the landscape. And you can understand how the landscape has been valued by different members of the community. There are also lots of online sources that you can use. So some of them, and I'm not going to be going into them in too much detail today, once again, just because that isn't the main focus of this talk, and I focus on that in a different talk of mine. But different sources you can use is Cambridge University. There is lots of aerial photos on a website called Britain from Above, which is photos that were taken by planes after the war. If you want to try and research an area, that can be a really useful source. And Google Maps. And I will quickly click on Google Maps just to show you how I use it. Here we go. Right, so Google Maps is a fantastic source for archaeologists because it's essentially aerial photography or satellite photography of every single field in the country. Now, this here is near Braunswell. Now you can see, hopefully, that we have lots and lots of shapes in the ground. Now, when you have archaeology under the ground, it actually affects how crops and how grass grows. If you have lots and lots of stones under the ground from an abandoned house, that will restrict the roots of a crop and they will grow quicker and die quicker. If you have old ditches, you will be able to see lots and lots of crops that are growing slower because the ground there is wetter and their roots are able to grow deeper. And so you can see different patterns. Now this is lighter, so that tells me the crop is growing and dying quicker. So we're looking at probably stones under the ground. And this is probably a whole village here. You've got the main routeway running through the middle. You've got different buildings. So this might even be a deserted medieval village, this one. I'd have to double check to make sure. But I do recommend going to your village, going to the area that you're studying, going to the landscape you're trying to understand more about, and have a look at Google Maps, properly examine every single field. You might see those plough lines going like this across a field. And if they have a slight curve to them, like an S shape, those will be medieval ridge and furrow. If they're dead straight, like these ones here, those are modern day plough lines. So don't get too confused with that. And so let's see if we can go back to the presentation. There we go. So that is a really, really brief run through of how to look at a landscape when you're going out and about. Like I said, I can't go out and I can't give you a tick list. I can't give you particular things to look for. I encourage you to get out and to get an eye, get a feeling for a place and to slow down. I cannot emphasize that enough. You need to slow down and really look at every building, really look at every field, notice what looks out of place. That's what you're looking for. And that's the big clue for you to go and do that additional research and find out about what more you can find that can tell you a story about that place. So I'm quickly going to stop screen sharing so that I can pop back onto the main screen and just see, oh, yep, chat's gone quite busy. I say, does anyone have...
I've been keeping an eye on the chat, Lydia.
Yeah, does anyone have any particular questions that they would like to go for? Or are we okay and people want me to continue?
There was one from Maria, but I've said that I'm going to cover that in an email separately because it gets into, I think, what will be a fairly legal talking about legalities
yes.
of getting into archaeological sites in the UK, but nothing. I think there's been nothing else particularly person at present, unless anyone wants to put the hand up now.
No, are we all good? Or yeah, we'll keep going then, just because once again I'm aware of time. Let's see, go back to screen share.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Right, we'll keep going then. I did say I was going to let people have a quick break, so we'll just give you a couple of minutes in case you want to pop to the loo or anything. So we'll start again, perhaps at 10 to. So just a couple of minutes to run off if you need to. Yes, I think I did see one comment there saying that they felt this was fairly simplistic at the moment. So once they see a road, you know, it's tarmac, yes, it's modern. And yes, that is a really, really basic example. I completely get where you're coming from there. It's more a display to show the kinds of questions that you need to be asking. And so a lot of the time, roads, yes, they can look really boring. But understanding if that road is completely modern. So for example, the Lincoln bypass, completely modern. There was no roadway or trackway there before. So that's not going to tell me much about the history of the landscape. If, however, I'm looking at a tarmac road that's directly going to a church, that's probably been a trackway since the medieval period. And so that's telling me about how people were moving around the landscape. If that road is going to another nearby village, that tells me that in the medieval landscape, people were perhaps moving between these villages quite frequently. Similarly, we do in Lincolnshire have one of the perhaps most famous Roman roads in the country, Hermione Street, going from London all the way up north. That runs through Ancaster up to Lincoln. And so once again, understanding the history of that landscape is really important. Roman roads wouldn't have originally been in the middle of nowhere. You would have had settlements on the side of them. People who are bringing in goods have their farms based on the side of them, so they can farm and then quickly transport their goods into Lincoln to feed the legion who were stationed there. And you also have smaller settlements trying to sell people things. Just as we have roadside services today, you'll have had similar things in the past, people with inns or trying to sell their wares to travellers on the road. So I completely get where you're coming from and saying, yes, this is very simplistic, but it is a starting point, and it's a starting point to all the different questions that you can build up and an understanding of the landscape as you go further on. Okie dokie, hopefully everyone who's had to dash off is back with us now. So I'm now going to take you through the wider context of Lincolnshire. And I feel this is going to be more helpful than simply going through and noting all the different things you might see in the landscape. We're going to actively focus on things that you might see in Lincolnshire that are worthy of note in understanding the archaeology of the region. So I'm going to be referencing a project that was carried out in 2011 quite a bit. And this was a project that was defining the historic character of Lincolnshire. If anyone is interested in that, because that is a really good report in understanding the different landscapes of the county. If you email Felix afterwards, I can pass him on the information to the link to the report and you can get it for free online. But in this study, they ended up dividing Lincolnshire into different historic character areas. So we have lower lying areas, such as the confluence, that's the Isle of Axholme I was talking about earlier. You've got the fens, you've got the wash, you've got the grazing marshes, and you have the higher areas. So you've got the wolds and you've got the northern cliff and the southern cliff there. So just try and keep that map in mind. We've got perhaps two higher areas coming down here, and we've got the lower areas coming down between them. What is quite significant about Lincolnshire, perhaps more than any other county in the UK, I think in a way, is the amount that we have changed shape as a county. The wash down here, that was underwater until relatively recently. If you were living in Roman times and in Holbeach, you were on a coastal settlement. We have done a lot of work, not only recently, but since the Roman period, in changing how this land interacts with the sea. Basically, we used to have a lot more marshland and fens, and people would have been living in these very, very watery areas by hunting fowl, hunting fish, collecting reeds. Salt making in this area was huge because we had such a huge coastline to be able to produce salt and sell it on elsewhere. So a lot of these areas have had huge amounts of change, but you will not see, for example, as many Bronze Age barrows and things down in the Wash, because that area was more underwater in that period, and you don't tend to bury your dead in that kind of area. So we do have to understand a little bit about how this county has changed. So I'm going to try and keep this broadly chronological, just because that's the way my mind works, as to the different things that you may see. And we're going to have a look at the different landscapes and at the different sites you may see within them. So first of all, something that is hugely significant in Lincolnshire are Neolithic long barrows. We don't see them all over the country, so it's important to know that we have them in Lincolnshire, and we have lots of them. They are found almost, not totally, but almost exclusively in the wolds, so in higher areas. Now, long barrows are burial monuments. They are long and almost rectangular in shape, and they are lumped up, so they are quite, if they haven't been ploughed out, you can see them as a big lump on the landscape. And in them, we often find Neolithic people. So these are Stone Age, when people first start farming. And we find the bones of lots of different people. So they are communal burial grounds. Now, what's significant about them is we have lots of burial monuments in Lincolnshire. We do not have lots, if almost any, buildings. We have no evidence for Neolithic buildings, really. And this is a pattern that's echoed across the country. And so we don't quite know what's happening. Maybe they had wooden buildings that have been completely destroyed. We've got no evidence of them, nothing survived. And so we're missing a load of evidence. Maybe people were still moving around the landscape a lot, so driving herds of cattle, setting up a temporary structure, moving on again a few years later. And yet they still wanted to have their dead in a constant, permanent place. But what is significant with a lot of these Neolithic long barrows is they are found in the wolds in these beautiful high locations. There seems to be some significance with having them in high scenic locations, so they can be seen. Now, in the wolds, we have nearly 60 known ones. And so what you're looking for are lumps and bumps in fields. Now, the ones that we know about, some of them have been destroyed, unfortunately, but a lot of them now do have protection on them. And this means farmers cannot plough them. So sometimes a really good thing to look for is an area in a field that a farmer is not ploughing. He's gone round, it might be fenced. In this case, the farmer has just simply let trees grow over it, which is really bad for the archaeology, but it hasn't been completely destroyed. And so that group of trees would immediately be drawing my eye. And as soon as I see a lump within it, I can tell you almost with certainty that that's a Neolithic long barrow there. And so that's telling me about the landscape of the time. Now, the wolds would have been covered in trees at the time, and if people are living there, they would have been cutting them down to make way for farmland. They were known for making these really big monuments, and they had with them what we call the Neolithic package. So we're looking for evidence of permanent housing. Like I said, we've not really found that yet. They've started farming, so they'd have had things like sheep and goats and cows and pigs and plants such as wheat and barley, and they would have pottery as well. So this whole culture would have been in the area, but the only evidence we have are these Neolithic long barrows. So they're a really good one to look out for if you're in the wolds. We're going to take a huge jump in time now and have a look at Hermione Street. Now you can see evidence of Hermione Street, which is the main Roman road, as I was saying in the break earlier, in both the north and the south cliff areas, and it goes directly through the middle of Lincoln. Settlements tend to flank it. So in the Roman period, as I was saying, you'll get settlements on either side of it, not only trying to sell their wares to people traveling on the road, but also if you're going to set up a farm, you might as well be near the really easy access point to be able to take your goods to Lincoln to sell them. But this is a pattern that we tend to see in later periods as well. Once the Romans have put that road in, people keep using it. So they keep using it in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the medieval period. And so we do tend to see that even in the medieval period, settlements tend to flank Hermione Street, and they don't have to be directly on it. They can be a mile or two either side, but there tends to be a concentration of settlements going up the country. And so that's an example of how an earlier landscape is directly influencing how people are living in a later period. And that, of course, brings me really nicely to Roman Lincoln. So this is a good example of urban landscape archaeology, because Roman Lincoln was in a really strategic position, which is why the Roman army really liked to utilize it. It was directly on that hill. All of you who've walked up steep hill know exactly which hill I'm talking about. And the fort was at the top of that hill. It didn't come down the hill so much, and that's where they stationed the soldiers who were working out of Roman Lincoln, and it was where the castle and the cathedral are today. Now, if you have walked up Steep Hill, that is almost directly on Hermione Street, so you'd have been walking up where you would have entered Lincoln, and coming out the other side, you have Newport Arch. I'm sure a lot of you may have seen that. That is actually the Roman archway. Now, the impact on Lincoln is huge, because walking around the town, there are actually more standing Roman remains than you would realise. So this is a time where I'd really recommend you go on to one of the sources I can show you online to actually find all those different sites. Alternatively, you can just type in standing Roman remains in Lincoln into Google, and people have written blog posts. They've done their own research and posted it online for you to really walk around and notice all those different things. And that is actually a really, really good exercise in getting your eye in to different forms of architecture and noticing when a wall in a building might be older than the rest of the building itself, because that's Roman, it's been built on later. So that's a really, really good exercise. Moving on in time again, we have medieval churches. Now, I will admit quite happily that medieval churches are not a Lincolnshire phenomenon, but they are really significant in Lincolnshire, to understand Lincolnshire's landscape. Churches were the centre of any medieval settlement. They would have been the ones that brought people together, that kept people in line. And you can really see that in the investment people put in the buildings. I often say to people, why do you think people in the medieval period were happy to pay and work and use their hands to create these buildings that survive till the modern day? These beautiful stone buildings that are extended time and time again and constantly used, while they themselves lived in wooden houses, probably very drafty, and they weren't willing to put the same investment in their own settlements. One way of explaining it is saying that in the medieval period, you were not guaranteed a long life by any stretch. Disease was around, famine was a very real risk. And if you know you're not going to have a long life, but the priest comes along to you one day and says, but if you put your money into the church, I can guarantee you a really good afterlife, you're going to be investing in your afterlife, because that's going to be a much longer period of time according to your belief system. And so people do, they invest in the medieval churches more than they invest in the rest of the village. And that's why we have medieval churches in almost every single village that are still standing. And often they are the oldest building in the village. Every other building has been built or rebuilt over the years. A really good example of this is up in Barton upon Humber. It's actually one of the oldest churches we have in England, so it's a really important site. And if you go around the building there and you have a really close look at the stone, you will notice some bits of Latin and some odd markings in places. And that's because a lot of the stone of the building has been stolen from nearby Roman settlements. So we have reuse of materials happening. The size of churches that we have in the county also attests to the previous wealth we have. So the bigger your church, the more wealthy your village. Now, walking around Lincolnshire today, I don't think I'm going to cause too much controversy in saying that we are not the richest county in the country. And we're not known for being the richest county in the country. And so it can be surprising when going around to see some quite big and distinctive churches. Clearly some workmanship and some artistry has been put into place in building those. Now, this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, in the fens, if you are walking around, if you are trying to navigate your way to another town, in the fens, landscapes are few and far between. But if each church has a slightly different spire, you can say, oh yes, that's that village over there. And oh yes, I can see that's that village over there. And you can actually use the churches themselves as milestones in a way to be able to navigate your way through the landscape. And so that's one reason. But the other reason is we did not always used to be not the richest county in the country. In particular, if you go to Boston and have a look at the Boston Stump, that is an absolutely huge and beautiful church that can sometimes perhaps seem out of place with the current economic situation of the town. Now, if you remember earlier when we're having a look at that photo from Boston, I was saying, oh, there's some beautiful buildings here. That is because Boston actually used to be hugely significant due to the trade of the Hansa merchants. So they were trading with people in Europe through the Hansa network, and they were having all the wealth of Lincolnshire coming down with them and being traded out of Boston. Boston became hugely powerful, actually. It was at one point the second wealthiest town in England, which is why they had the money to build this beautiful church. And they, in addition, they had friaries, I think 4 or 5 of them, all being supported by the same town. And so by walking around the town, looking at the buildings, looking at the quality of the buildings, looking at the size of the buildings, I challenge you to go inside Boston Stump and actually feel the size of the church. I can tell that this town has a rather rich past, which further research would tell me. Going further up the river in the Witham Valley, if you walk along the river, you will notice that there are lots of ruins of abbeys. So this is a picture of Tupholme Abbey here. And we also have Bardney Abbey very close by to that. And there are other ones as well. Abbeys, as a general rule, they have businesses. They are trying to raise money. And not all of them are fabulously wealthy. But in this situation, a lot of them are. And the fact that we have a lot of them all around the Witham suggests that the Witham is producing a trade that a lot of people are able to tap into, and it's building lots of wealth. And in this case, it's wool. Today, sheep farmers can struggle to turn a profit. Wool goes for an insanely cheap amount of money. But back then, wool was the fiber. It was what you wanted to trade in. If you had lots of herds of sheep, you were a rich and wealthy person in medieval England. And so a lot of these abbeys did have herds and flocks of sheep. And so the wool they were collecting from these sheep was being transported down the river. So that was a really easy trade and transport network. So once again, the Witham not being an inconvenience, it's being a way people are moving around the landscape. And so this is all in the Clay Vale here. And so all of this wealth would have been going down to Boston. Of course, it's Boston who's then doing the trade. They're taking in their share, building the huge Boston Stump. And so it's telling a story of all of these buildings that we have and of why they're so huge, why they're so grand, even though that seems out of place today. And we also have in this county castles as well. Now this here is a picture of Bolingbrook Castle. The Civil War changed the tone, essentially. So all of a sudden, people who have perhaps been living here, not in complete security, Boston was plagued by pirates. In the Anglo-Saxons, we had the Vikings coming across. But all of a sudden, Civil War changes things. And so we need to start building defences. And so if you see a highly fortified defensive area, you might be looking at a Civil War history that has had its impact upon the landscape. Now, Lincolnshire was primarily for the king, and the Civil War brought a lot of castles that perhaps were not being used defensively back into use. Now, if you find some castle remains, do take your time if you're allowed. Not all of them are on public land, but if you're allowed to walk around them, actually try and trace the ring of the defences. Look inside, and often you'll see a blank area. Please do remember that there would have been timber buildings within there. So once again, take your time to build up the landscape in your mind. Think of how it was started. People then building the walls, building the timber buildings inside, how it had been used, how it would have been abandoned as well, and how it came to look as it does today. Now, Bolingbrook Castle was built by the Earl of Chester and Lincoln, and he had two other castles as well. It had a whole walled enclosure, it had turrets, it had been an incredibly defensive building. And with the English Civil War, like many castles, it was returned to being a military use. Now, it was held by royalists, but after a siege, it was torn down by the parliamentarians, and that's when it became a ruin. And so just by walking around this, I'm going to bring up lots of questions that's going to trigger me to go home and research this castle and its impact upon the landscape. We also, in this area, especially in perhaps the south of the county, so thinking around the area of Ancaster and Grantham in this area down here, we have quite a few stately homes as well. So this here is a picture of Belton House. We also have Woolsport Manor. A lot of these are either in private hands or in public hands, such as, well, not public, charitable hands, such as the National Trust. It's really good to not only look at the local area, the rural landscapes, the farms, but to have a look at these richer landscapes as well, because these estates have had a huge impact on the landscape. Not only do we have a beautiful building, but they've completely changed the state of the outside area as well. And a lot of them would have had parks. If you've ever had a walk around Belton House, you'd have seen the deer there. That is a throwback from when that whole area was a parkland for people to, well, for the people who lived in the house to enjoy. And these estates were built off of the wealth, once again, of the wool trade. So they're telling us a story of how Lincolnshire was really wealthy in the past. Now, what's important to remember about this as well is that these buildings did not exist in isolation. And if you do enjoy going around National Trust properties, please take a moment to look at the wider landscape, because the stories you may find surprising. So have a look on a map when you're going. By all means, enjoy your day at the National Trust, but then drive to the nearest village, park up there and have a wander around the village. Because often you might notice that the stone that the buildings in the village are being built from is very similar to the stone the stately home was built in. And they look quite posh. Perhaps they have decorations or coats of arms embedded into the buildings. Now, this is because the villages were often built the same time as the estate, because these are estate villages. They were used to house the workers of people the grounds people, the people who were making the estate run all the time, the estates were effectively in themselves creating a completely new economy in the area just to keep the estate itself running. And so that changes the landscape as well. Enclosure. So if you want to see some really good examples of enclosure, you can go on the Wolds. The Wolds is renowned throughout the country for the way it looks as a countryside, the rolling hills, the fields, but enclosure affected everywhere. So no matter where you are, if you go out in the fields, if you go driving around or walking around, you are going to see these large square fields. They did not always used to look like that. Medieval fields were a lot smaller. They were perhaps more around a village rather than covering the landscape. And this is because of several periods of enclosure. Enclosure was not a single climatic event, as it's sometimes described as. It happened over several periods of Acts of Parliament. And this was basically due to pressure from the government to be producing more food due to increasing population, but also to wars with France, which meant we were having to feed and also pay for an army as well. And so people were having to find ways for the land to work harder. And one way was for people to only be growing the types of crops that did best in that soil. So if you've got really clayey soil, grow your root vegetables and the leeks. If you have soil that's better suited to wheat, only growing wheat. Now, this meant that a village could not grow all the different crops it needed to sustain itself. So what happened was Parliament effectively grouped together plots of land and went, yes, this is better for growing root vegetables. This is better for growing wheat. This is better for having cows. And an area would start to specialize in a particular type of food. And for that, they used bigger fields. And that pushed a lot of people out of the landscape and into towns to find alternative employment. It was hugely controversial because, of course, a lot of that land was taken away from the people living in villages who had relied on it for generations and put it into the hands of larger landowners. Enclosure in itself, I could do an entire talk on. So I'm going to keep this quite brief. But it's just to remember when you're walking around the landscape that fields have been laid out, they have been designed. And to remember that is to remember the history and the huge disruption the enclosure caused to the landscape. Drainage and reclamation is also a really important landscape feature to watch out for. And of course, in this, you are looking out for dikes. So this is mainly going to be seen in areas such as the confluence area, as it was described, so the Isle of Axholme, the grazing marshes, the fens. And what's really important to remember once again is there was no one drainage event. We like to talk about Cornelius von Meuden in the 1600s, and when he did huge drainage projects, hugely controversial. There was quite a few arson attacks on his workers and the like, because once again, it was land being taken away from common people to be put into the hands of landowners to use and to farm. It actually has been happening for thousands of years in this county. The Romans were doing drainage and reclamation work. They were doing it in the medieval period. The abbeys and the monks were doing it to improve their land. Von Meuden was doing it. Even today, we have the Environment Agency working out different ways that we can manage water so that we're better protected from flooding. Drainage and reclamation has affected our landscape. And so some things you can look out for, and this is perhaps better to look at a map rather than walking around. But if you look at the coastline and you see a line of villages coming down the coastline, but perhaps 5 or even 10 miles inland, you're probably looking at a previous coastline. All of those villages would originally have been on the coast. Also, if you're interested in the names of towns and villages, keep an eye out for place names such as Somer, so S-O-M-E-R, is an older form of the word summer. So that might mean that that settlement was only being used in the summer. when it wasn't flooding as much. Coates as well, any place name ending in coates, so COTES, means huts or temporary structure. So once again, just because an area was floody doesn't mean it was never being used. You might be looking at villages that used to be temporary settlements that were only being used in the summer when the floodwaters were down to graze their livestock. It does also mean that it can be quite hard to see some features of landscape archaeology pre the drainage and reclamation. For example, areas that have had serious drainage work on them, such as the area around the Isle of Axholme, they were using a technique called warping drains, which would help to drain the water, but then when the tide came in, the tide would come back onto the land, bringing up all the silt and the really nutritious river soil, dumping it on the land and then being drained out again. And this added meters and meters and meters of soil onto the original ground level, which of course brought it out of the flooded areas, made it easier to farm, made it really, really fertile to farm on, but means that any archaeology pre that period is now going to be buried under meters and meters and meters of soil. Which means that we can't see a lot of archaeology in some of those areas from previous periods. So it is also important to remember the impact of drainage and reclamation may have in actually obscuring what you can see about the past as well. Moving on again, transport. We still have lots of train tracks in this country, but we also have lots of disused train tracks. A lot of them may be pathways that you know as now, tracks or walkways. To identify them, they do have a particular feel and look to them, but they may go through abandoned railway tunnels, or they may be banked to one side. They're generally wide pathways and straight to gradual corners. This is one of the things that OS maps can be really handy on. They do tend to note down disused railway paths. And you can sometimes see the echo of the railway if there isn't a path, perhaps in the shape of the fields as well. You can see where that railway used to run. A good example is actually the line to Skegness. If you follow the railway line all the way to Skegness, you'll see it takes a really, really odd corner. It's even sharper than a right angle. If you continue straight on rather than taking the right angle corner to Skegness, you can see the disused railway line then disappearing into fields. You can see it in the curve of the fields and then coming back down the coast again. And this is because in the past we were using rail transport a lot more. Now this was a twofold factor thing. First of all, we have lots of ports on the coast here. We've got Grimsby, we've got Cleethorpes, we've got Boston. Goods coming in and out of the county needed to be transported around. Railway lines were great for that. But perhaps even more influential, especially for areas such as Cleethorpes and Mablethorpe, is the Industrial Revolution also meant that people were being moved to cities. And so suddenly coming to the seaside to take the air or take the waters was being recommended as a cure-all almost. If you're feeling down or depressed, go to the coast, take the waters. If you're under the weather, go to the coast, take the waters to get the fresh air. It was believed that sea air had a really good invigorating effect on the human body. And so this, for the first time, created the kind of influx of tourists. And so railway lines were being almost funded by tourists coming to the county, people travelling to Cleethorpes to take the waters, to experience the side of the sea. And this actually caused places such as Cleethorpes to be transformed. We started inventing things such as promenades and places for people to walk along the seafront. In Cleethorpes itself, there is actually a ruined castle on the seafront. That is not a real ruined castle, that is a pretend ruined castle, because people thought it would look more scenic to have some old ruins to look at, and they didn't have any real ones they could use. So understanding how people were moving around the landscape, once again, gives you an understanding as to what's been happening in the past. Of course, moving on in time again, war defences are a really common landscape feature that you might see. First of all, a lot of them still in use today, RAF bases. If you see an RAF base, you know it was there in the World Wars as well. But we also had a lot more. Lincolnshire was sometimes just called RAF Lincolnshire. We had so many RAF bases here because it was such a good area to be accessing Europe. We have lots and lots of flat ground. We're near the coast, and it was ideal. We also had, because of that coastline, coastal defences. So this picture here is from Freeston Shore. If you go for a walk down there, you will see pillboxes such as this one, gun emplacements, coastal lights, all of these sorts of things can be seen as a way of fortifying the coast, and they've been left there. Another one, which is much harder to spot in the landscape because it is mostly buried, is of course Holbeach Bunker. Not very well known about. It's actually one of the sites that we look after as a charity. This was a bunker that people were in and used to spot aircraft coming over, and to then take that information and pass it on, that we could see, oh, this aircraft is coming over here. We can identify where the German planes are in the country and where we need to defend. But this was actually revived in the Cold War as another monitoring post for the Cold War as well. And so war has had an impact on our landscape as well. Now, I knew there was a slide about maps that I've missed. So here we go. So once you've gone around your landscape, and I do apologise, this slide should have been in the previous section. I must have forgotten to move it. If you want to find some older maps, in addition to OS Maps and Google Maps, this site here, I very much highly recommend. It's called the National Library of Scotland Maps, and it is free access to high resolution colour maps from across the country that were drawn between 1560 and 1964. Most of them are in the last 200 years. You can buy hard copies, or you can actually print them online for free. That is permitted by the website. And so I'll quickly show you them now. So this is the website. Because I'm visual, I find it easiest to use the outlines. And this is just to show you how to use this website if you're not aware of it. Type of modern place name. Let's see, where should we go today? I've been talking about Boston a lot. Let's look at Boston. There you go. We can see the whole area is covered in squares. So if you click on one of those squares, a box will come up here, and it's got all the different maps available. So if I wanted to have a look at a map from 1889, all I've got to do is click on it. And there you go, that's Boston in 1889. And this is a free resource available online. And you can see once again how important this river Witham is coming through. You can see the dock there as to how people were using the landscape, and you can see the landscape around it. So a lot of fields, and use that to build up your story. So I apologise that wasn't in the first half of the talk. I'm not sure why that slide is there, but that's that. So I'm just checked the time. I'm just within time. I warned you this was going to be a very, very brief and very, very basic introduction to landscape archaeology, because it is a huge topic. If you want to hear more about the sources and about doing research at home, that is a different talk of mine. So by all means, have a chat to us and see if we can do that if there's a lot of interest in it. And I hope this has given you a basic starting point into landscape archaeology. I've said it before several times. I'm going to say it again. Please just get outside if you can, whether it's walking, whether it's going in the car, whether it's going on your bike. Please just get outside, stop and look. Just look at every single detail you can see and ask yourself why, how. That is the best advice I can give you about landscape archaeology. Question everything that you see. and use that to propel you into further research. And by doing that, you will gain such an extraordinary understanding of your landscape that it will change your feeling, I believe anyway, of the place that you live, of the place that you're researching, and make you feel more connected to the story that's been going on there. So I hope that has been of help. I will once again stop sharing screen and we'll see if we have any more questions coming up.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Lydia. That's been really, really interesting. Like I say, it's such a huge subject. I know I did my first degree. We covered that. It took 3 years to cover that. And I think even then, that's probably still not the end of study into subjects like that. And I think kind of leading on from what you were just saying, with a lot of these landscape features and with the historic environment, often these things are hiding in plain sight, I think kind of is a nice kind of way of summing it up. And hopefully that has kind of possibly illuminated a little bit as how you might kind of be able to kind of better understand the area you live in, whether that's towns and villages like Louth and Heckington, or whether it's just the open countryside of the Lincolnshire Wolds. So what I'll do now is go through some of the questions, starting with a question from Brian Hodgkinson, who asked, is there a reason why later villages were not situated on Roman roads?
Yep, so not all villages, even back in the Roman period, they weren't always situated on Roman roads. If I say Roman roads is like a highway, so a good comparison today would be commuters. If you know that you have to travel into town every day, you want to live near the highway so that you can travel in really quickly. If you know that you're going to be traveling into Lincoln frequently, you're going to want to live near the really good route way to get in and out. If you are a farmer or a craftsperson who is living in a landscape, you're actually not going to be traveling to the main town frequently at all. There is no reason to be living near the main Roman road. So you're going to be choosing where you live based on other factors. So if you're a craftsperson and you need a particular material, you might live near where that material can be found. Lincolnshire has also been a huge producer of salt and clay because of the types of soils that we have here. And so if you're working with clay, you're going to be living near a clay extraction sites rather than near somewhere you can access a town quickly. That's a really basic answer, but basically it's your needs, and it's the exact same today. You choose where to live based on your individual needs. Do you want to travel around? Do you want to live in a scenic place? Do you want to live in the middle of a town? Do you want to live in the middle of nowhere? It's based on what people need out of their landscape is where they choose to live.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Lydia. There was another question from Claire Harding, who asked about, can you recommend any reading about identifying older settlements and field boundaries in the landscape? And I suggested Hoskins, The Making of the English Landscape. And I was thinking maybe Oliver Rackham, the name of the book I can't remember off the top of my head, is also another good one that he did. Did you know of any others potentially that Claire could look to find?
Is this general landscape archaeology, or is this also learning about Lincolnshire landscapes as well?
She hasn't said. I think it's
okay. Assuming you're also talking about Lincolnshire landscapes, I really recommend looking up online the 2011 report on the historic character. That's freely available, and it takes you through every single character area in Lincolnshire with a historic background to the landscape. So that's really useful in understanding the different landscapes we have and how the different industries have impacted those landscapes. So it gives you a good starting point into what to look for. There is also a fantastic book called An Atlas of Lincolnshire, and that is lots and lots of different maps of lots and lots of different factors. So it could be Roman settlements or 16th century brick merchants and things like that. And it tells you where people were living and how they were interacting with the landscape, with a page explaining the patterns that you see as well. So that's a really good book.
Brilliant, thank you. And then what I'll do is I'll probably just, I can send out as a follow-up to the email just a list of some of these books, just for anyone who hasn't had a chance to write them down while we're here. There's a bit of a multi-pronged question here from Maria, which I think will kind of lean more on your commercial archaeology background, Lydia, but I think hopefully you might be able to answer this one. So it's how long does archaeological excavation take at these archaeological sites, or do you work with rescue archaeology? How many people are involved in the excavations, and is it a research team only, or is it only archaeological, or do you have an multidisciplinary team?
Okay, yeah, that's quite a multi-pronged question. I'll answer it as best I can, but by all means, if you want to have my email address afterwards and to send me more questions, just ask, that's absolutely fine. So in this country, we have our main form of archaeology. Most archaeological sites are what we call commercial archaeology, and that is a form of rescue archaeology in that it's the archaeological excavation that takes place before any building works will destroy those remains in the ground. So that could be houses, that could be roads, that could be pipelines, anything like that. And on those sites, we have a policy which is called the polluter pays, which means that the person who is doing the building work has to pay for the archaeology to be carried out. Depending on the size of the project and the amount of archaeology we're expecting to find, will depend on the amount they have to pay for. A lot of sites for perhaps 1 or 2 houses will be just a couple of archaeologists on the ground for perhaps a week, just to do a quick watching survey. Yep, there's nothing there, move on again. We do a lot of quarry sites, which are perhaps smaller teams, probably around 5, but they will be there for years as the quarry gradually extends. Sometimes you will get a big project, such as, for example, we had the Lincoln Eastern Bypass recently, which was the bypass going around Lincoln. That must have been, because I was on that project, it must have been getting on to 100 archaeologists working very intensively around there. But that was because also they knew they were going to be going through some densely archaeological sites, if that makes sense. We went through Bronze Age barrows, Mesolithic scatters, Roman buildings, loads of stuff. So they put in lots of archaeologists to that. Another good example is the HS2 link, well, not an Lincolnshire example, but that at the moment is actually causing an enormous drain of archaeologists in the country because they need so many to work on it at the present time. So it very much depends on the site, what we're expecting to find and what we actually find. Depends on how long it takes and how many people. So it kind of is a how long is a piece of string type question.
Okay, thank you for that. And then I think there's one other question in the chat, which is also from Maria, and it's this one's more linked to the kind of drainage landscapes and the fens you were talking about, which is how did drainage impact the kind of landscape and archaeological heritage, and what are the kind of current consequences of kind of, I'm guessing, ongoing drainage? Did you mean, Maria, for that second part of the question?
It's difficult to say because, as I said, it's covered up. We think they've covered up a lot of landscape, and they're covered up to the depth that, first of all, is too deep to really excavate in some areas. So we can't actually excavate down without doing an absolutely huge project. Of course, we have health and safety. We can't dig too deep down without stepping a trench to make sure it's safe. So it would be absolutely enormous. But also a lot of the areas that were drained, like I said, they had these warping drains, which brought in really, really rich agricultural soil, which means they're now being used for farming. Now, like I said a moment ago, most of the archaeology in this country is paid for by people building roads, building houses, building pipelines. They're not building those things on really, really fertile agricultural areas because we're using them for agriculture, basically. So we're not doing we're not doing nearly as much archaeology in those areas. So that is a blank spot kind of in our area, in our understanding. And I think it's really important to be aware of that and not just go, oh, there's no archaeology there because we have no evidence. Go, well, actually, we haven't properly looked down there because there just aren't the projects at the moment. So it's a blank spot, I would say, is to understanding exactly what's been lost. Maybe actually nothing has been lost. Maybe it has always just simply been marshland and people haven't been using it, and there is nothing to find. That is also a totally reasonable theory. I find it unlikely though. As humans, we've always been very good at exploiting every single landscape we have. So we would have been exploiting those marshes. We just don't have the same evidence of it.
No, yeah, no, I think I agree with that. I think it's kind of especially in the Lincolnshire context, in those kind of lands where it's been reclaimed from the sea. I think there's always an element that part of their intended use, however intensively utilised, is that they're almost there as a sacrificial element, aren't they, to prevent the kind of more urban and settled areas from rack and ruin, essentially, in really adverse conditions. So I think there's a kind of a balance there. Obviously, there's probably lots of evidence there. It's just probably will it be ever discovered? It's like you say, is the question, isn't it? And I think this is the last question, just on the basis I know we've run over, and I don't want to kind of keep. I know we said we're conscious of running over by quite a long time, and that's from John Hewson, who has asked, is there an update on what was found prior to building the Lincoln Eastern Bypass?
That's a really, really good question. I'm quite pleased I had a chance to talk about it. So every single time we do an archaeological excavation in this country, as part of paying for the excavation, the person doing the work has to pay for the report to be published in a publicly accessible place. That means it is not behind a paywall. It has to be freely accessible to everybody. Unfortunately, I don't know how many of you have read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but there's a piece in the book where they say, where did you find that form? It was down the broken cellar, with the light bulb that doesn't work and the loo saying beware of leopard. It's kind of like finding that. We're not particularly good at telling people where they can find this information. The information for any archaeological site, not just the Lincoln Eastern Bypass, can be found on a site called ADS, the Archaeological Data Service. And you can use that to search any archaeological report. It'll have a link to it. You can download the PDF, get all the information. As to the Lincoln Eastern Bypass, another thing we're really, really, really bad at as archaeologists is publishing something in the same year that it was dug. I don't think it's ever happened. Once we've finished digging, the amount of work that has to happen to get a report to publication stage is huge. All the finds get sent to individual specialists who know about that sort of artifact. They look at all of them, they weigh all of them, they can tell stories about them. You have to bring together all of the information. As an example, I recently did a very, very, very small community archaeological dig. It only went over 2 weeks, so it wasn't very big at all. And it took us 2 years to publish the report because of the amount of work that went on afterwards. The Lincoln Eastern Bypass is absolutely enormous. So I do not know off the top of my head if the report has been published yet. A little bit of me would be surprised if it has, but they may well have put up an interim report of the main things that were found. So what I will do, if it's okay with you, is I will go away, I'll research that and send the information to Felix and get him to add it to the resources list that I've been talking about today. Is that okay with you, Felix?
Yeah, no, I think that sounds good, because it's
I hope that sounds okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think the only thing to add on there is, as well as kind of sources like the Archaeological Data Service, there is the Lincolnshire Historic Environment Record that is run by the County Council, and they should also have copies of any reports into archaeological kind of work that's been done. I've put a link into the chat there for the Heritage Explorer.lincolnshire.gov.uk website, which has an interactive map which highlights all of the monuments that the HER hold and any references. So you should be able to find all of the rank and file information about those reports that they hold, and then contact them independently, potentially, to get a copy of those. And then I'd just kind of like to finish, I think, there, really just to say once again, thank you very, very much to Lydia for the talk this afternoon. It's been really, really interesting. And I think there's been a few comments in the chat saying that people are now headed out with it to walk their dog, to go and have a bit of a look around, which I think is what we're really after here. And then just to say thank you all for attending, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And like I say, we've put the event on today as part of the Lincolnshire Local Listing Campaign. So if you think there's something, if you're from Lincolnshire and you think there is something that's kind of worthy of kind of some kind of recognition and further understanding of it being a heritage asset in the county, please kind of visit the Lincolnshire Local List website and just kind of contact us and let us know what they are, and we'll look to see if we can put those on a local list moving forward. yeah, I think that's
excellent.
fun.
Thank you very much, Felix.
Thank you, everybody. I can ask everyone to unmute there. I think there. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I'm the one who's meant to end in the meeting.